I put together an animation of illustration though that I did, which was a project, just an internal a project for myself of a character that's running. He's like a Confederate soldier. I don't know if I've got his uniform right, but I did an illustration which kind of looked okay in itself, and it got to a stage where I could polish it further, and I was like, well, it's all right, but it's not amazing. But I thought what I could do with it would be to animate it. And what I've done is I've put together an animation here where I've taken the first frame, or my initial illustration, and I've made a 6 frame run cycle with it, where he's running with his rifle there. And I'm just going to go through the process of how I did that. It's an overcomplicated animation, in all honesty. You know, you can animate an entire animation like this, because it just get really complicated per frame, the amount of painting that you'd have to do. But it was a nice little internal project, or a project for myself, which looks okay. You know, there's a lot of things I would change about it. Still, you know, there's some elements haven't worked and some have. But you know, it's a test. It's an ongoing thing, as everything I do, try and improve as I go along. So to go through the process of it, I took the animation, or took the illustration, which was this one here, and I wanted to create a run cycle. So essentially, I've got my first frame here, but then to do the frames after that, or the frames that I require, the first thing I did was just to do an outline of that first frame, if you will, and I hashed in a bunch of other frames just using Photoshop animation features. I've done kind of a rough tutorial for these before, which it's a very basic and easy system to use. It's not necessarily something you would use for like doing a big animation production, but I quite like it for doing things like very quick animatics and very basic animation cycles and things, just to test stuff out, because changing the frame rate is pretty easy. Adding frames is very easy as well. I won't go into that here, I've done it in the previous tutorial, but what I'm going to cover with this is mainly just how to block out the character, really. So I've taken the character here, and what I want to do is to create each of the individual frames. The first thing I would do is to look at Muybridge and a Muybridge sprint, and that's a really important feature of when you're doing your animation. There's the animator survival toolkit, if I've got that correct. Let me just check. Which is a fantastic book for doing any animation at all, certainly character animation. And I'll just find it here. The animator survival kit. It's certainly something you should look up if you're interested in doing any kind of animation at all. The Animator Survival Kit by Richard Williams, it's absolutely superb. So that would be the first point of reference to have a look at how, because he goes through the individual points of runs and things and walk cycles, and you know, I can only aspire to be as good as this guy. The other thing to look at is to look at Muybridge, because he's a fantastic, or he was a fantastic photographer, and he took photos of people in motion. And what I've done is I've taken these basic shots where I've drawn these shots based on his photos of a sprinter running, and also video YouTube footage of sprinters running, slow motion footage of sprinters running and things. So I've put together these frames based on that. So I would have drawn out and picked my frames, 6 points in the cycle that enable me to do an entire both steps, and then go back to the start. And I've looked at the reference for that and tried to pick out 6 key frames for doing it. The first one I did was the first and fourth frames, 1 foot and then the other. So it's 2 entire stretches, and they were quite easy to put together because I could take the left leg, or the right leg here, and I could duplicate this leg here. When it comes to frame 4, I simply drew in or copied the leg over and just put it in that frame there, and then drew in this frame, this leg in the background. So a lot of the parts that I've got here I've been able to copy and paste from other frames, and that starts to build up after a while. You're able to copy parts of other legs and things to get the angle right. The other thing to do as well is to look at the shapes within the legs if you're having to do a new frame. And what I would normally do is break it up into maybe cylinders and basic forms. So if I take this upper leg, for instance, and this lower leg, I would break this up into its cylindrical form, and then maybe a cube or something for the foot. And that's an easier way then of understanding what's going on with these parts of the body. So here's another one there, and another one there. And all the time what I'm trying to do is to make sure that these all share the same kind of perspective space. And that's what I've done with this entire body, really, taking each of the main parts and breaking it down into its cylinder and its cube. Then once I've done that, I've drawn over it so that I get a rough body shape in there. And then I've got my basic run animation in there. Now I did quite a few different frames, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. And this is a key thing with it, is that often you can do some sketches which will, when you're starting to do stuff, you'll make plenty of mistakes, and this sketch stage is crucial in order to get the motion right in the first place, and to get everything, to make all your mistakes early on and try out the motion, because the motion is essentially what it's all about. The other thing I did was just broke up a couple of things, like I think I broke the head off. I might have done, I'm not entirely sure I did. Yes, it's layer 21, but this is the head in here. And for this, instead of having to repaint it every single frame like I've had to do with the body, I just simply move the head to a different space. And Photoshop animation, if I move that over there, it'll remember all the other frames, but it'll also remember where I last moved it for the frame that I'm in. And that's a really handy part of Photoshop, in that it will remember position of objects and also opacity of objects as well, opacity of layers when you go from frame to frame. So if I wanted to do some tweening on like frame 4 here, I could take what I've used for frame 3, which I've confusingly called number 5, and I can take what I've taken for number 5, which I've called number 9. You can see how I've had to copy and paste lots of things, and I can take that and drop the opacity right down, and it'll still remember that the opacity was 100 on frame 5, and then it dropped down to 13 on frame 4. So it will remember opacity and position, and that's really handy, this animation, for this particular animation system. So I've got my frames there where he's moving from left to right. There's a few things that I referenced. There's a slow motion sprinter. There was some footage from a newsreel footage of bayonet practice in the First World War, and also Muybridge, and also the book, which was the toolkit book, which was really handy for all the different keyframes. So I've got these all hashed out here. So I got into so I've taken this footage, or these frames that I've put together, turn them white and put them over the main character or the main character painting, and I've started to hash in some of the frames here. So you can see with this one, I've bent his leg round, really roughly painted that in, trying to use the same kind of lighting and stuff, and copied and pasted stuff like the foot here. I moved and copied and pasted into this section here, and I'm also wanting to try and get some general movement into the bag and stuff, so I just chopped out the bag and just moved it up, and all of these parts are pretty easy to copy and move around, and quite convenient. Then I've done that for the remaining frames, just hash them in, and you can see with rough colour, you can see where I've copied and pasted parts in, and there's bits and pieces chopped around all over the place. I've also taken parts that are particularly awkward, like the gun here, and I've copied that onto its own layer. And it means that it's easier to move around. The hands and the gun are much easier to move around. I've accidentally painted something there, and I can move that around on its own, because if this isn't on a separate layer and I need to move it and adjust it later on, and it's part of this body, it means every time I move it I'm going to have to cut it out and paint what's underneath, which is going to be a real pain. And I decided to do the same for this kind of bayonet scabbard here, and also for the bag. So split those later on. I split those off into separate layers, and you can see this in this run cycle here. Still sort of pretty rough, but I'll just turn this light off here. So for this one, what I've done is I'm just going to turn these lights off. For this one, I've gone into more detail, and I've taken each of the frames that are roughed in and I've painted them up a little bit further. I've merged all. I was happy with the placement of the gun, so I merged that into one layer. But for the bag particularly, I've kept that on a separate layer so I can move it around and I can change it. And it's on a separate layer, and it's per frame as well. So I've got a bag 5 here, and then for this one I've got bag 6, and because they're all slightly different, and just enables me to make a few changes so that when he's running, that bag bounces up and down and backwards and forwards. The same thing goes for the pack on his back as well. Layer 1, everything was merged together, but the pack on his back here is a separate layer, and I've moved that so that hopefully when he runs up and down it kind of jostles and bounces around there. And also I've done the same for the bayonet as well. So they all have their own separate layers in there. The other thing that I've done is I've added, I'm just going to reopen this run cycle, because I also added in some lighting, which I'm going to use later. It's on a separate layer. It's on screen. The blending mode is screen. I've changed the opacity down to 38, and on each layer I've painted in a lighting effect. So if I turn this effect on and off, you'll see the difference there, and it means that it's giving me some light in on this side of him that's lighting up, and I can turn that on and off in After Effects. It's a little bit shonky in places, but because the movement is so quick, it enables me to, it doesn't show up too much. It's a very dramatic and a quick scene, so it's not too bad. It probably needs a bit of refinement though. So in here what I've done is I can take in this animation, these frames, and I can loop them, and the way I can do that is I've imported the running animation, the run cycle. If I just drag that and just put this into a test sequence, I would just take this now and just check. I've got 10 seconds. Oh, it's on a loop. Yeah, so I've added this in as a loop already. So I'm just going to delete that. I'm just going to import in a new one. Let's have a look. So let's take the run cycle we've got here. So there's a new one, and I want to be able to loop it like I've done with this one. Now if I go into this, you'll see it's only 6 frames. I'd need to make sure that make sure I've got the right one for a start. Let's have a look. Yeah, that's the right one. So if I right click on this, I'm going to check how it's interpreted the footage, because mine's 10 frames per second, so it'll run very fast at the moment because it's set at 30. So all you need to do is to go to click on it, or right click on it and just go to interpret footage and main, and you can change the frame rate in there. So I've got my frame rate there, and I want it to run over like 10 seconds. I'm just going to adjust that because it had gone from a 30 frame per second animation to a 10 frame per second. So it won't readjust it automatically. It'll add the frames to it'll adjust it in the timeline, but you need to pull it so that it fills that entire duration. And what I then want to do is I want to loop it. To loop it, I'm going to go Control Alt and T will give me my time remap, and then if I Alt click on the stopwatch, I can add in an expression, and I'm going to type in loop out open and close brackets, and then click anywhere off that, and that means that the time remap will allow me to increase the time that the frames loop over, or the time that the set of, or the footage duration, should I say, because you're allowed to remap the time. And this expression will allow me to loop the footage, and that will create a loop in there. So if I grab him and pull him down there, that means I've got this looping footage in there. So that's given me that. The other thing that I did was I've got the light which I want to add to him, as I mentioned before. Now this may have the loop applied to it. Let's see if it has. No, it hasn't, so that's quite handy. So this loop, this light, I'll just need to line it up properly. I think the pivot is in exactly the same place, so I'll just move that to there. This is my light here, and if I take this light part, or this layer here, and do exactly the same thing, which is Control Alt and then T, go back to stopwatch, Alt, and then click on the stopwatch, and then in there I can just put in loop out open and close brackets, and click anywhere off that, and that means again I can make those both loop for as long as I need them to. Now what I'll also do is I'm going to take this light here, and I'm going to change the mode to screen as well, which will hopefully help just brighten that up as well, because you have all the blending modes that you normally have in Photoshop. I'm just going to have a look. There's not much difference, to be honest. It's a little bit. It depends on what the opacity is as to how much effect it's going to have on this. But what I'm going to use this for is I'm going to turn the light on and off to indicate, it could be an explosion or thunderclap or something like that. So I can just close and then reopen that. I'll get the transform, because that disappears when you first put time remap on. And I'm just going to animate the opacity. So take the opacity down to 0, and moving on a couple of frames, turn it on to 100. I'm going to just select that frame, Control C, Control V, and paste it. And then because this frame here is at 0, I'm going to copy that one. Don't really need to move the time slider to it, to be honest, and then paste it there. And that means that'll turn that light on and off. So when it runs, the light appears. With it being grey, it's probably better if I just duplicate that, and you'll get a better idea. So just duplicate that layer, and then that light turns on and off, so I get this lighting effect while he's running. So that will just give me the looping animation and a lighting effect in there. So going back to the main composition, this is the comp that I did using that effect, and I've got a couple of apart from this, I've moved him across the screen going from left to right because I'm able to do that by because he's a single layer. I can just simply grab the light and the run cycle, and I've just keyed it to move from left to right to give him some progress across the screen. And you can see there that I've added the light in a couple of times, so there appears to be an explosion, and it's in conjunction with a orange solid which I've got up here. I've just masked in this bit of orange area here. The mask is just simply drawn around there. in this kind of blob, I've made the mask feather about 146 pixels. That stops it. If I'd have left it at 0, it would have looked like that. Whoops. It would have just looked like that. So the mask feather I've put right up, whacked it up to the maximum, and it's given me this blur. Again, I've made it a screen, which gives you a slightly different effect. You can see the screen is going to have an effect very much dependent on what's underneath it, and it's going to brighten and lighten a lot of that, a lot of those layers underneath. And the way I've done it is I've keyed it so that this brightens up, the opacity changes on this mask up and down in conjunction with the light appearing on the side of him there. In fact, if I deselect that, so it gives the effect of the environment affecting him, which really helps to, hopefully helps to place him on the screen and add to the action. The layers behind, it's just a simple parallax where I've got the smoke, which I've split into two separate parts, a background smoke and a foreground smoke, and then this background layer of smoke in there. It's very subtle, but they just move at different rates in the screen across to add to that level of progression in there. So you can see them progressing across the screen, and you can see the background parallax changing. And the grass was got pretty complicated. It got into lots of separate layers. So I've taken a section of grass and I've keyed it to move and scale across the screen like this. And essentially what I've then done is, if I go into the test, if I take a load of grass in here and just pop it in here, I have my grass moving, or grass moving across the screen there. And I need to do the same looping to this, so I'm going to take that, Control, Alt and T, add the time remap to it. Alt, click on the time, the top stopwatch. I'm just going to go loop out, open and close brackets, and that will loop the grass so that it's looping across there. And what I do is I duplicate it, and then I shift the time bar a little bit on it so that it's the same section of grass, but it's moving away because I'm shifting the time slider along, or this part along. It's coming in at a different time. Let me just check which one's on top and which one's not. That one's on top, so I need to move it so this one's on top. And then if I take that again and duplicate it and shift it, I'll get this load of grass that's moving across the screen here gradually, and so you can see that the grass sort of accumulates and moves. So it's constantly looping. There's one or two gaps in there, but that's moving from left to right, and it will give the appearance of, it'll give the appearance of movement through. I also needed to add a bit of perspective, so I create another section of grass as well, again, which I'm just going to put the time remap on, and this section of grass had to have a bit more of an extreme perspective on it, so I've moved this one over here, and that moves off into the distance, so I can sort of move off on the distance that way. Because things run so fast with this, in fact, I'm going to scale it up a bit. Because the grass, once it's accumulated, runs so fast and everything moves so quickly, you can kind of get away with it if I just duplicate and move it, duplicate and move it, duplicate and move it, duplicate and move it. You can see I can get this constant progression of grass moving over here. So I'm just going to move that to the side a bit, move that along. So that's the sort of general breakdown of how the grass is moving in there. So if we go back to the comp, Once that's been duplicated enough times, and I duplicated it rather a lot, you'll get the effect of the grass moving across the screen like this. And hopefully the perspective kind of works, it's okay. It probably needs a bit more tweaking. But because I pre-comped it, I did a pre-composition of the grass, it meant that I could make some changes to the grass composition, which is in its own composition here. And I can make changes to the way the grass moves in this scene, and then it'll affect the other scene. So I can just grab these frames. If I shift these frames up, for instance, it'll mess up the grass in here. So you can see how that's not going to work. Go back here and just undo that. And that's because I'm using a pre-composition. So that pretty much goes over the basics of putting the scene together and the different elements that I was able to use in order to add in effects and trying to get the sense of action and emotion and things in there. The last thing I did was just popped in an adjustment layer as well, just to increase just to make some changes to the settings of the gamma and the sort of various different levels and things, so that I can just make a few changes, and that just sits right on the top, which was just a handy little thing to do. If there's stuff that's in Photoshop where you're thinking, I just need to adjust some brightness and contrast, if it looked okay in Photoshop, but then when you put it in footage it's not looking quite right, you can just adjust things using the adjustment layer in there. And that's it.